A kid drops a bike in the front yard just as the streetlights flicker on. There's dirt on their clothes, a scrape on one knee, and maybe a bent handlebar from a story no adult witnessed. They walk into the kitchen, and someone looks up and asks a single question. You okay? No one tracked the route. No one sent a text asking where they were. No adult knows exactly what happened during the last 4 hours. Decades later, that same person watches a child leave the house with a phone, location sharing, scheduled check-ins, and detailed instructions. And they say it with a mixture of pride and disbelief. When I was your age, we just went outside. We came home when the streetlights came on. It sounds like a simple comparison between two generations. Kids were tougher back then. The world was less complicated. Parents trusted children more. There were no smartphones, no social media, and no constant digital surveillance. But maybe that sentence contains something deeper. Maybe many Gen X adults don't only miss the old neighborhood, the empty lot, or the freedom to ride a bike without a destination. Maybe they miss the feeling that part of their life belonged entirely to them. A territory no one was monitoring. A few hours that did not need to be explained, documented, optimized, or shared. And that raises a more uncomfortable question. Were they free because adults trusted them? Or did they learn to call it freedom because they knew no one was coming to check? For many members of Generation X, childhood meant disappearing for long stretches of time. You found friends by looking for bikes in front yards. You invented games with rules that changed every 10 minutes. You explored construction sites, creeks, vacant lots, back alleys, and corners of the neighborhood your parents had probably never seen. When something went wrong, there was no immediate adult intervention. If the bike chain came off, you tried to put it back on. If you got lost, you looked for a familiar street. If two friends started arguing, the group had to negotiate what happened next. If boredom appeared, no one rushed in to remove it. And those experiences could create something psychologically valuable. Evidence. Not encouragement, not praise. Evidence. Evidence that you could face a small problem and survive it. Confidence is often described as a feeling, but much of it is built through repeated experiences of action. You encounter difficulty, try something, make a mistake, adjust, and eventually discover that discomfort is not the same thing as disaster. This is one way self-efficacy develops, the belief that your actions can influence what happens next. You do not develop it only because someone says, you can do anything. You develop it because the chain fell off your bike, your hands got covered in grease, you struggled for 20 minutes, and somehow you got home. You develop it because you took the wrong turn, felt a flash of panic, slowed down, recognized a landmark, and found your way back. The lesson was not that nothing bad could happen. The lesson was that uncertainty did not automatically mean helplessness. And maybe that is part of what many adults are mourning today. Not danger itself, not neglect, but the chance to discover their own competence without someone interrupting the process too early. Because when every difficulty is immediately solved for you, you may remain safe, but you lose the opportunity to learn what you can handle. Still, the freedom of that childhood was not only physical, it was psychological. For a few hours, no one knew exactly what you were doing. That meant you could try on different versions of yourself. You could act fearless around one group and quiet around another. You could invent a ridiculous game, fail at something embarrassing, say the wrong thing, change your mind, and move on. There was no video, no permanent record, no family group chat discussing your behavior before you got home. Most childhood mistakes disappeared into the afternoon. That kind of privacy gave identity room to remain unfinished. And identity needs unfinished space. Before you know who you are, you experiment. You imitate people. You exaggerate traits. You belong to one group, then another. You test what feels natural and what feels like a costume. When every experiment is observed, evaluated, or recorded, it can become harder to separate curiosity from performance. So, when a Gen X adult becomes irritated by constant notifications, location sharing, or the expectation of instant replies, they may not simply be rejecting technology. They may be reacting to the loss of an inner space they once considered normal. a life in which being temporarily unavailable did not require an apology. But this is where the nostalgia becomes complicated, because two children could spend the entire afternoon alone and have completely different emotional experiences. One child knew that if something serious happened, they could go home. They might be expected to solve small problems, but help was available. The adults were not hovering, yet the child felt held in mind. The freedom came from trust. Another child also stayed out for hours, but this child avoided going home with problems because problems irritated the adults. They hid injuries. They minimized fear. They learned not to ask for rides, comfort, attention, or help. Their independence looked almost identical from the outside, but internally it was built from a different lesson. Do not need too much. One child explored because there was a safe place to return to. The other became self-reliant because depending on someone felt unreliable, embarrassing, or dangerous. That difference may remain invisible for decades. Both children can grow into highly capable adults. They solve problems quickly. They remain calm during emergencies. They know how to improvise. They do not expect life to be convenient. Other people may admire their strength, but one adult can use independence as a skill while the other uses it as armor. The first person knows I can handle this. The second person feels I have to handle this because asking for help is worse. That is why competence alone does not tell you the full story. Sometimes the person who appears strongest is not the person who feels safest. They may be the person who learned earliest that vulnerability created complications. You can see it in ordinary moments. They are exhausted but reject support. They solve everyone else's problems, then disappear when they have one of their own. They answer, "I'm fine," before checking whether it is true. They feel guilty when someone takes care of them. They need long periods alone, not only because they enjoy solitude, but because being emotionally reachable can feel like being monitored. And sometimes they become intensely nostalgic for the childhood that created this identity. They laugh while telling stories about making their own dinner, caring for younger siblings, staying home alone, or figuring everything out without adults. And their pride may be completely genuine. Those experiences may have built real courage, creativity, and resilience. But the story can still be incomplete, because saying, "it made me strong," does not answer another question. Did you have anyone to go to when being strong was not enough? Sometimes nostalgia protects more than a memory. It protects the meaning we gave the memory. If you built your identity around being independent, admitting that you were lonely can feel like weakening the entire story. If you believe your childhood made you capable, acknowledging what was missing may feel like betraying your parents, your generation, or even yourself. But two truths can exist at the same time. You may be grateful for the freedom and still recognize the absence. You may value the person you became without pretending you should have carried everything alone. The purpose is not to decide that Gen X childhood was good or bad. It is to become more precise about what the nostalgia is asking for. Maybe you do not want to return to a world without seatbelts, supervision, or communication. Maybe you want to recover unscheduled time, privacy, the right to be unreachable, the ability to make small decisions without explaining them, the confidence that a problem can remain a problem for a few minutes before becoming an emergency. And perhaps you want to keep the independence without continuing the isolation that sometimes came with it. That could mean turning off notifications for an hour without feeling guilty, letting someone help before you reach total exhaustion, allowing children to solve age-appropriate problems while making it clear that support remains available, creating parts of your life that do not need to be productive, documented, or performed for an audience. The question is not whether you should become less capable. The question is whether your capability still requires you to prove that you need no one. So return to that child walking through the door after the streetlights came on. The scraped knee, the abandoned bike, the stories no adult witnessed. Maybe that child felt powerful because the world was open and home was waiting. Maybe that child felt powerful because feeling powerful was easier than admitting no one had been looking. Most likely for many people, it was a mixture of both. And perhaps that is what adulthood allows us to understand. Freedom and care were never supposed to be opposites. Healthy freedom is not being abandoned, so you learn to survive. And care is not being controlled, so you never learn to move. Real freedom is being allowed to explore, make mistakes, and become capable while knowing there is still someone available when you return. Maybe Generation X does not only miss a childhood with fewer rules, maybe it misses the feeling of having a life of its own. And the adult challenge is not to recreate the old absence. It is to recover that sense of ownership without returning to the loneliness that sometimes came with it. If this brought back a memory you understand differently now, share it in the comments. And subscribe for more conversations about the hidden psychology behind the stories we tell about ourselves.